Okay, never mind, I'm mixed up. Time to take another sip of coffee here. Okay, at least you can't see me reaching for the water bottle. So it's really slide 11 we're going to. It says Ho Chi Minh and the Indochinese Communist Party. So as Ho Chi Minh organized in northern Vietnam, his efforts were assisted by a terrible famine in 1944, not all over Indochina, but just in northern Vietnam. This allowed organizing and solutions such as raiding granaries and distributing the grain to the people that greatly boosted the credentials of the Vietnamese communists amongst rural leaders who tended not to truck with communism, but over time, these conservative people and many other conservative people in Indochina began to realize that there may only be bad choices, but the communists were the least bad choice. Please don't tell Fox News I said that. However, it's the unfortunate truth. So, Ho announced the creation of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in September 1945 after the Japanese surrender. Actual governance had to be postponed until 1946. Fortunately for Ho Chi Minh, the French were not immediately interested in destroying him. They decided that his appeal was too strong in the north to oppose him. They decided to take the rest of Indochina, or try to keep the rest of Indochina. That is, what became South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They also began operating in parts of North Vietnam. And tensions between the two sides eventually erupted into war. However, China's victory in 1949 meant that the Viet Minh, as they called themselves, had a gigantic base area. They had a lot of support from China and an easy path to get it. So the war between the two sides, with Ho Chi Minh trying to convince the French to give up the South, and then fighting to try to advance, and the French being successful at first, occupying the cities, a very familiar scenario from China, but eventually losing the war. Went through a period of 5 years, shorter for the French, more merciful than the American involvement 2 decades after that. Nonetheless, though, a disaster for the French. The French did not fight smart war in Vietnam. They were not actually on the verge of defeat when they made the mistake of putting a large force into a place called Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu rests in a river valley. It's surrounded by hills, and there's a photograph in the middle of this slide you can see here that shows that clearly. They believed that the Viet Minh would not be able to bring artillery to bear because there were no roads in those hills. However, they were ignoring the unfortunate fact for them that the Vietnamese moved large amounts of supplies by bicycle and using water buffalo and using just human strength. the Vietnamese were able to bring artillery pieces, small ones, but artillery pieces nonetheless, into those hills. And when they were ready, they began bombarding the French position in the valley of Dien Bien Phu. When that battle was over with, it was not so much because the French were unable to bring force to bear. It became a political question. If the French had been some other power, let's say the Nazi Germans, and if they had been next door to the battlefield rather than half a world away, the result might have been different. However, that was not the case. The French public had grown disillusioned with this effort, and the French were forced, not only for the practical reason of losing a lot of soldiers in a stupid place, but also because there was so much political opposition at home, including amongst the political elite, a very important point. The French were forced to sue for peace, and there was a conference in Geneva to decide on the future of Indochina. The United States attended that conference, and the conclusion of the conference was that the Vietnamese would be allowed to hold elections all over the country from the north to the south, and that the powers would respect the outcome. However, the Americans, who are nothing if not astute pollsters, discovered that the elections to be held in the South would probably result in a victory for Ho Chi Minh and the Indochinese Communist Party. And so the Americans did not sign the Geneva Agreement. Instead, they picked a leader. And that leader was eventually was settled on, was named Ngo Dinh Diem, or otherwise known as Diem, D-I-E-M, Ngo Dinh Diem. Let's go on to the next slide. Why did the United States do this? Why did they invest so much money and treasure in trying to prop up what amounted to a ridiculously inept and corrupt minority regime in a highly populated mainland Southeast Asian country? The United States Washington leaders believed that there was a plan on the part of Moscow and Peking to take over all of Southeast Asia, one by one, country by country, using these popular revolutions. And we were desperate. We were desperate to stop that process. People felt that if it was allowed to go on, that before long there would be communist troops knocking at the gates of Sydney. Not that Sydney has any gates, but anyway, you get what I mean. Unfortunately, there was no appreciation at all for the strength of the communist position in Indochina and its relative weakness in other countries. The U.S. had, for some reason, they could see that there had been success by the British in Malaya, but they were still concerned that a communist victory in Indochina would lead to a communist victory in Malaya. And the numbers just aren't there. In Malaya, a minority of people were interested in supporting the communist cause, a very small minority. The pool of potential applicants, you might say, the pool of potential supporters only amounted to about 15% of the population. And the majority population, about 60%, 65% of the Malays, hated the Chinese, and they still don't like them very much today either. There was never any chance for a successful communist revolution, and they're Muslim. So there was never any chance for a successful communist revolution in Malaya. The whole idea was just dumb. Similarly, there was never any chance for a successful Catholic-led government in Vietnam. There are a lot of Catholics in Vietnam, but not that much of a lot. Only about 10% of the population at the time was Catholic. And the political elite that made up the government of the Republic of South Vietnam was Catholic. And it remained Catholic even after the Diem regime fell, about 2 weeks before John F. Kennedy was assassinated in late November 1963. And in the days before that, in June of 1963, there was a very interesting and tragic incident. There was a shooting of some demonstrators who were protesting the shabby treatment of Buddhist clerics by the Diem government. That shooting led a man to immolate himself in the downtown area of Saigon. Now, Diem himself was not married. He was a bachelor. His vice president was married to an interesting woman who went by Madame Nhu, N-H-U, Madame Nhu. That was the name of her husband, Vice President Nhu. She said, she had very good English, and she was an object of attention, both because of her fiery temper, her fluent English, and her voluptuous figure. She was an object of attention by the Foreign Press Corps, and she knew that, of course. So she was asked what she thought about this self-immolation, and she said, "I don't know why anybody should be concerned about a Buddhist barbecue. They set themselves on fire and we clap our hands." This is, I'm not giving exact quotes, but I'm paraphrasing it pretty closely. So you can see the reaction. The person who drew this cartoon you see on the bottom was named Herblock. He was probably the most influential political cartoonist in the United States at the time. And there you see his reaction. Madame Nhu also criticized the Buddhists for allowing a self-immolation like this, saying that if they really want independence from foreign products, they shouldn't be using gasoline because that was imported. What a wit she had. This spelt the end of the Diem regime. He was asked to denounce her comments, and he wouldn't do it. So the Americans, to get back to the main point, didn't make the same mistakes as the French made at Dien Bien Phu. They, instead of putting large concentrations of troops in valleys where they could be fired down on, they pursued a different strategy. They constructed fire bases throughout the country. These fire bases were always at the military crest of a hill, that is not quite on the peak where you can easily see somebody and pick them off from a distance, but rather about 10 meters down from the peak of a hill, from where you could fire down on the enemy if they tried to assault you. Some of them had helicopter landing pads, of course. I think probably most of them did. And using this strategy, the Americans put fire bases in different parts of the country. They supported them from the air. People went out on patrols from these fire bases in order to confront communist forces. They had artillery so that the patrols could go out, and they'd bring an artillery spotter with them, a forward observer. The forward observer would call in the artillery and call in airstrikes. And by doing this, they hoped to find and destroy as many communist troops as possible and wear them down through a war of attrition. Unfortunately, this didn't work too well either, because, again, the numbers were just not with the Americans. There were, you can see in the readings, there were two major Buddhist organizations. These two organizations were not inclined to support the communists, but they were nationalist, albeit millenarian. That is, that they believed that the end of the world was coming. And they were not inclined to support the communists, but they were very much anti-Catholic, because the Catholics didn't treat them very well. If the Ziem government had been smarter about that, maybe history would have been slightly different. In subsequent years, after Ziem was overthrown, a new government came in, and it was unfortunately not much different. It retained the basic characteristics of the Ziem regime. It was a minority government. It did not get along with the majority of the population. It was centered in the cities. It had very little appeal in the countryside. And it was clearly a puppet government of the Americans. The Americans told it what to do, and that was very obvious. It had no will of its own, really. Let's go on to slide 13. Just a quick note. One of the interesting elements of Southeast Asia is that its population, its demography, has been formed largely by ancient patterns of immigration. And those ancient patterns of immigration resulted in the original inhabitants being forced from the lowlands up into the mountains. The people who presently live in those mountains are referred to as hill tribes. They are ethnically distinct and linguistically distinct from the majority populations, that is the lowland Lao, the lowland Cambodians, the lowland Vietnamese. Their relations with the majorities in their respective areas have been tense. They don't get along. Their languages and cultural practices are quite distinctive from the lowland majorities. They somewhat resemble each other because these are, after all, the ancient peoples of the entire region. Of course, they speak languages that are quite distinct from each other as well. And these groups often have relatives across borders. They're allowed by the Chinese, by the Vietnamese, by the Burmans, by the Cambodians, etc., to cross between borders because they will anyway. There's no point in trying to control it. But if you ever travel there, don't you try it, because you're a foreigner and the rules, normal rules, will apply to you. I bring up these populations because many of them became the allies of the Americans. Why were they the allies of the Americans? Because they were uninterested in, they tended to be more anti-communist than other people. They were uninterested in seeing another new repressive government come in. The Americans became very adept. One of the successes of the Americans in the Vietnam War was to forge relationships with minority peoples in different parts of Indochina and recruit them into the anti-communist cause. And this is one reason why there are large populations today from minority hill tribes from Southeast Asia, from Indochina, living in the United States. We'll stop here and go on to slide 14.